married and enjoyed an incredibly privileged life together alongside their elite guests. 2 years after the Fontainebleau Hotel was established, on January 19, 1956, Bernice gave birth to a baby boy, Ben Jr., who went by Benji. Their son was undeniably spoiled and reportedly a friendless, misbehaved child who derived pleasure from taunting the hotel workers and firing them for absurd reasons. As he grew older, he remained somewhat of a loner who often bragged about his family's wealth, with one close source stating he wasn't really an easy guy to like. Still, the Novak family seemed to have it all, but in 1968, Ben and Bernice divorced, and by 1977, Ben filed for bankruptcy and lost ownership of the hotel. Benji was distraught and blamed his father for the financial collapse. Still, he channeled his anger into motivation and started his own convention staging business called Novak Enterprises, where he employed his mother as a secretary. In the mid-80s, Ben Sr.'s health began to decline. Benji attempted to have his father declared mentally incompetent to gain control of his million-dollar estate, but he passed away of heart and lung failure before that could happen. A woman working for the family actually accused Benji of over-sedating his father and controlling his ability to communicate with other people, though Benji has never been charged with any wrongdoing relating to his father. Now, beyond his obsession with wealth, Benji was also a regular at strip clubs, which is how he met Narcy Veliz. She was a former exotic dancer from Ecuador and a single mother to daughter May Abad. The two got married, and over time, Narcy and May started helping Benji run Novak Enterprises. Then in 2009, tragedy struck. Benji discovered his mother Bernice dead in her home, and although the crime scene was suspicious, her death was listed as an accident due to a fall. Still, Benji found many things strange about the circumstances surrounding his mother's demise, including the fact that there was a glass of white wine out on the table when that wasn't something she drank. Plus, large amounts of blood were found in her car and scattered throughout the house. It's unclear why the police didn't investigate Bernice's death more at the time, but despite Benji's suspicions, the case was closed. Following her passing, Bernice's $2 million estate was rewarded to her son, which included the second largest Batman collection in the country, something Benji was very proud to own. But little did he know that the worst was yet to come. 3 months later, Benji's company was intended to oversee an Amway convention attended by more than 1,000 people at the Hilton Hotel in Rye Brook, New York. He and Narcy were staying in the hotel's penthouse suite while working the event, and at first, everything appeared to be going fine. But then, Benji answered a phone call from a hotel worker just before 7 in the morning, informing him that there was overcrowding at breakfast. Narcy took it upon herself to handle the issue while Benji got some rest, but less than an hour later, she would return to make a bone-chilling discovery. As Narcy stepped inside the suite, she stumbled upon her blood-soaked husband lying on the floor and immediately dialed 911. Authorities rushed to the gruesome scene and confirmed right away that the hotel heir was deceased. Investigators believe that Benji had been savagely attacked by more than one person while sleeping and subdued using duct tape around his arms, legs, and mouth. Furthermore, a medical examiner later noted that he had been stabbed and bludgeoned to death with dumbbells, resulting in 20 cracked ribs. Even more disturbingly, someone had gouged out both of his eyes. Police were baffled that the room showed no sign of forced entry, and given that nothing had been stolen, they assumed the attack had been personal. Still, they needed to speak with witnesses and collect hotel surveillance footage to understand better what happened, including a detective who recalled that at Benji's murder scene, there was blood all over the hotel room, and it was clear that the hotel heir had been violently murdered. But for some reason, Narcy kept asking if he had passed away from a heart attack. Furthermore, the hotel's card key reader system showed that no cards had been used to open the penthouse suite until Narcy returned to the room after sorting out the breakfast situation. CCTV footage showed Narcy was downstairs assisting hotel workers when the murder was believed to have occurred, but even though it looked like there was no way she was involved, investigators still had to bring her in for questioning. Narcy told them that she feared the door might have been left ajar when she went downstairs, which would explain how someone entered without a key card. I mean, it seemed like this guy had plenty of enemies and people who might have a grudge against him.
I have no clue what happened. I have nothing to do with my husband's death.
However, as detectives continued to question Narcy, it became clear that things in their marriage were far from hunky-dory. In fact, they learned that in 2002, Narcy had reportedly handcuffed Benji to a chair in their home under the pretense of intimacy. but after she subdued him, one or more men entered the house. Then, Benji was allegedly robbed and assaulted, and while he reported the crime to the police, he chose not to press any charges. Narcy remarked to police of this ordeal, "He used to like to be tied up." As Narcy kept talking, it also came out that Benji was unfaithful to her from the start, and that she was well aware of it. However, at that point, his company was raking in around $50 million each year, so it seems she simply turned a blind eye to his infidelity. However, she alleged that Benji had been physically abusive to her in the past, resulting in a broken nose. Narcy claimed her husband brought her to a plastic surgeon to fix her nose and that when she woke up, she had received a breast augmentation. Just to be clear, that story has never been confirmed and no action was ever taken regarding this allegation. It's certainly possible that the violence in their relationship went both ways. However, it's also possible that Narcy made this story up to portray Benji in a bad light. She may have hoped this would make her look more sympathetic or like a victim. Still, investigators were becoming increasingly suspicious of Narcy's behavior, but she was adamant that she loved her husband and would never do anything to hurt him. Not to mention, they knew that there were plenty of people who might want Benji dead. Now, this is where things start to go off the rails.
You want me to ask you straight out? Did you have any involvement in your husband's death? No. There is an electrical chair, and I'm a suspect. Give it to me right now. Put me out of my misery. I want to die.
Narcy returned to their home in Fort Lauderdale, but just 2 days after the murder, authorities were called to the residence. It appeared an argument had erupted between Narcy and her daughter May, who was living in a guest cottage on the property. According to police reports, the fight was sparked by May questioning her mother about Benji's will, and it ended with Narcy hitting her daughter with a crowbar. No charges were filed, and May moved out of the cottage. Then the police finally got the clue they needed to jumpstart the case. Someone sent an anonymous letter to investigators stating that Benji had been murdered by Narcy and her brother, Cristobal Veliz. So detectives traveled to Cristobal's apartment, and while questioning him, they noticed a bank receipt for $500 addressed to a man named Alejandro Garcia in Miami. Police took down his name and found that he had a lengthy criminal record. And with his mugshot in mind, they pored over the hotel surveillance tapes from around the time Benji was murdered. It didn't take long for them to strike gold. 2 days before the attack, security cameras picked up Alejandro Garcia and another Florida man, later identified as Joel Gonzalez, canvassing the hotel. Further digging proved that the two men had checked into a different hotel in Queens during that fateful weekend. Then, 4 months after the murder, Alejandro was arrested on separate charges and brought in for questioning. While he refused to talk at first, he wound up implicating himself by telling an officer that he was scared for his family because the people who killed Benji were very dangerous. At this point, police tracked down Joel Gonzalez, who was initially on the run but turned himself in and was more than willing to cooperate. Now, what he confessed to that day sent a chill down every investigator's spine. Beyond implicating Cristobal and Alejandro in Benji's murder, he pointed to Narcy as the mastermind. He also told them Cristobal had asked him to attack and kill May following their dispute. So, why did Narcy want her husband dead? Well, this is where Rebecca Bliss enters the picture. Investigators found out that she first met Benji through an online ad for escorts, but the two quickly became immersed in a serious and ongoing affair. Beyond talking regularly, Benji paid for Rebecca to move closer to him, covered all of her bills, and bought her basically anything she desired. He also told his mistress that he planned to leave his wife to be with her. Of course, Narcy discovered the affair and was absolutely furious. She allegedly contacted Rebecca on multiple occasions, even offering her $10,000 to leave him alone, but it didn't work. In one particularly heated instance, Narcy reportedly screamed, "If I can't have him, no other woman will have him." She also went to Rebecca's apartment manager and told her that Benji had passed away and would not be making further payments when he was still very much alive. So in 2009, threatened by the idea of her husband leaving her for another woman, Narcy did the unthinkable to ensure her financial gain. She contacted her brother and asked for help hiring a hitman to kill Benji. Under the impression that he would inherit a portion of Benji's estate, Cristobal hired Alejandro, who enlisted Joel. The assassins drove from Florida to New York, got a hotel, and then waited for Narcy to give them the signal. Sure enough, Narcy called them in the early morning hours and told them it was time. Then the cold-hearted wife brought them into the penthouse suite and remained present during the initial attack on Benji. She even handed the attackers a pillow to muffle her husband's screams and a towel to clean up afterward. Narcy possibly felt it would be too difficult to physically overtake her husband herself, which may have been why she enlisted help. Staying to watch the initial attack suggests she severely lacked empathy. Narcy had an intimate relationship with Benji, so to watch him suffer, knowing that she had the power to stop it, was very cold and callous. It's possible that Narcy could have also orchestrated the 2002 robbery and assault that occurred while Benji was handcuffed, possibly to punish him for some alleged transgression or for infidelity. She may have felt pretty powerless when he was unfaithful to her, so if she was involved, it could have been her way to take control. After Benji was killed, Narcy then stole around $100,000 in cash proceeds from the Amway convention and used it to pay the hitmen. As the investigation unfolded, a feud between May, who was convinced her mother had orchestrated Benji's death, and Cristobal broke out. As it turns out, Narcy's brother was concerned that May would interfere with his inheritance of Benji's estate. Meanwhile, Cristobal had no idea that Alejandro was in police custody, assuming he'd already fled the country, but he was still concerned that he might end up cracking. So, what does any rational person do? Well, they wouldn't hire someone to kill Alejandro, but that's what Cristobal did. As if this case could get any more twisted, a Florida reporter named Julie Brown took an interest in the case. Like many others, she found it odd that Benji's mother had died under such peculiar circumstances just 3 months earlier. So Julie requested access to Bernice's autopsy records and found that her injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall. Instead, the report stated that Bernice had suffered numerous fractures all over her body, including her skull, finger, and teeth. When Julie confronted the police with her findings, they begrudgingly told her that the case was closed, but what they didn't know was that Alejandro was about to blow the case wide open. While striking a deal with investigators, he shockingly confessed to killing Bernice as well. Oh, but not just that. He said he committed the crime under Narcy's strict direction. As a result, Florida officials were forced to investigate her death as a homicide. Okay, but why would Narcy also want Bernice dead? Well, you see, when Benji and Narcy got married, he established a prenuptial agreement stating his wife would collect $65,000 if they were to divorce, or she would inherit his $10 million estate if he died, as long as Bernice was dead as well, of course. Detectives later learned that Narcy and Bernice had developed a strained relationship while working together at Novak Enterprises. Some close to the family even went so far as to say the two women hated each other. Meanwhile, Alejandro accepted a deal and agreed to plead guilty to interstate domestic violence in exchange for his testimony at Narcy and Cristobal's trial. He was ultimately sentenced to 17 years behind bars, and he was ordered to surrender the $25,000 he received for the murders. Finally, in July 2010, just shy of a year after Benji's death, Narcy and Cristobal were each charged with his murder, and the following year, they were both indicted for Bernice's death as well. In January 2011, Joel Gonzalez pleaded guilty to interstate domestic violence, with death resulting, and was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. There were also 2 getaway drivers charged in this case. They both pleaded guilty and were given time served in exchange for their testimonies against Narcy and Cristobal. On April 23, 2012, Narcy and Cristobal's joint trial began, with prosecutors asserting the motive was hatred, greed, and vengeance. And yet another shocking twist, their defense attorneys argued that it was all May's idea and that she had set the whole thing up. So, is it too soon to hand out a Mother of the Year award? Regardless, Narcy's deranged attempt to throw her own daughter under the bus didn't pay off, as they were each found guilty for the murders of both Bernice and Benji Novak. They were also convicted of numerous other charges, including racketeering, domestic violence, stalking, money laundering, and witness tampering. Despite all the evidence, Narcy refused to take responsibility for her actions. Trying to pin the murder on her own daughter indicates that Narcy may have had narcissistic tendencies and only cared about herself. Narcy and Cristobal were sentenced to life in prison, and so far their attempts at appeals have all been denied. Here are some red flags from this case to look out for. Abusive partners sometimes make possessive comments suggesting that they are the only person you can ever be with. For example, they may say something along the lines of, "You are mine," or "No one else can have you," Or they may put you down by saying something like, "No one else would ever put up with you." It's important to recognize that both men and women can be victims of domestic abuse. Leaving or threatening to leave an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time. Please make sure that you have a safety plan in place before you leave. You can reach out to a counselor or other trusted professional in your area, or you can also contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline. When an innocent little girl is plucked from the safe streets of Queensville, Ontario, by a sadistic predator, police quickly hone in on a local weird-type guy. However, the case would take an unbelievable turn and wasn't solved for another 36 years. It was October 1984, and 9-year-old Christine Jessup was riding the bus home from school, excited to show her mother, Janet, the recorder she got in music class. However, when she got home, there was nobody there because Janet had taken Christine's brother to visit their father in a nearby detention center. Still, their absence didn't really faze Christine because she'd already made plans to meet up with a friend at the local park at 4 p.m. So, she grabbed some loose change and headed to buy a pack of bubble gum at the corner store, located right across the street from the park. Witnesses saw her make a purchase and then walk out of the store. Christine's friend reached their designated meeting spot, and she waited and waited and waited. But Christine never showed up. Meanwhile, just after 4, Janet arrived home. She saw Christine's backpack on the counter with the newspaper already brought inside, but she also noticed a few unusual things around the house that left a pit in her stomach. The first abnormality was that Christine's bike had been left lying on its side in their shed, with a visibly damaged kickstand. Next, her mother located the jacket she'd been wearing hanging on a hook higher than she knew her daughter could reach. So when Christine still hadn't returned home by 5, Janet took matters into her own hands and went to the park. She searched high and low, but Christine was nowhere to be found. Janet frantically called all of her daughter's friends, but when that effort also turned up nothing, she contacted the York Regional Police and reported Christine missing. Of course, authorities first speculated that the young girl might have just wandered off on her own, but Janet insisted that Christine wasn't the type to take off without telling her first. So the police initiated a search and sent both officers and volunteers to canvass the surrounding area. But unfortunately, there was no major crimes unit in this small town, and the police were ill-equipped to handle something of this magnitude. So instead of being treated as a crime scene, officers carelessly handled evidence found in the Jessup family home, such as removing Christine's jacket from the hook and disposing of the plastic wrapping of the newspaper. They also allowed neighbors to move throughout the house, touching whatever they came across. Preserving physical evidence is critical in solving crimes, and nothing should be moved or touched by anyone outside of those in law enforcement. When arriving at a crime scene, it's hard to know what seemingly minor details may end up being vital to the case, so everything should be considered evidence and carefully recorded and preserved. Heather Hoover, a close friend of Janet's, rushed to her side for comfort following Christine's disappearance. When interviewed on that fateful day, she told the police that she'd been working all day and hadn't seen anything. Then she politely told the officer that she needed to get home to help her husband with their children. More on that later. Days passed by and soon Christmas passed without a trace of Christine. Once police went public with their suspicions that the little girl had been abducted, the community became riddled with tension and fear. Little did anyone know that a grim discovery was right around the corner. On New Year's Eve, a man living roughly 30 miles east of Queensville was walking in a vast wooded area near his home looking for his dog when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. It was the horribly decomposed corpse of what appeared to be a young child. A pair of girls' underwear was lying near the body, along with a recorder bearing the name Christine Jessup on the handle. An autopsy soon confirmed everyone's worst fears, that the body belonged to Christine Jessup. The medical examiner concluded that she had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, with some wounds deep enough to pierce her vertebrae. Furthermore, the presence of seminal fluids led investigators to conclude that she had been assaulted before her death. They also located a single strand of hair from an unknown source wrapped around Christine's necklace. As the search for a missing child transformed into the hunt for a killer, the case was handed over to Durham Regional Police. However, rather than using information gathered by the York Regional Police, the new detectives decided to start the investigation from square one. They looked into any attention-grabbing leads, including a local kid known to carry a knife, a family friend who often made off-color remarks, and even Janet Jessup herself. But despite their best efforts, detectives weren't getting anywhere, so they decided to turn up the heat on the Jessup family. They grilled Janet about who else she thought could have been involved in her daughter's murder, and desperate to provide them with new leads, she mentioned a 25-year-old man named Guy Paul Morin. He lived right next door to the Jessups, and while he had no criminal record or behavioral issues, Janet recalled that he hadn't participated in the search for her daughter. She found that very peculiar because the Morins had actually been appointed school emergency contacts for Christine just weeks before she vanished. But then, Janet uttered something that would change the entire course of the investigation. After a final note, Janet told the eager police that Guy Paul had a few interesting hobbies, including beekeeping and playing the clarinet. On that, one of the detectives scrawled the words "clarinet player, weird type guy" in his notebook, and they left on a mission. Investigators maintained a friendly, casual disposition as they spoke with Guy Paul about his relationship with Christine. He claimed not to have known her well, but said they had a few unremarkable exchanges over the years and described her as sweet and innocent. However, he added the suspicious comment, "but they sometimes grow up to be corrupt." Detectives asked about his whereabouts on the day she went missing and why he hadn't helped with the ensuing search. Guy Paul answered by saying he'd been at work on the afternoon in question and that he wasn't present during the search because he'd been helping his father at their home. Detectives bid Guy Paul farewell and immediately went to check out his alibi. They found out he had punched out with a card just after 3:30, and given the distance from his home, he couldn't have possibly abducted Christine in that small window of time. Still, several weeks later, Guy Paul was tricked by an undercover officer while attending a jazz group into offering a few strands of his hair for a cosmetics class project on hair analysis. Unbeknownst to Guy Paul, his sample actually went straight to the hands of a forensic scientist named Stephanie Nisnik. At the time, hair analysis was commonly used to eliminate suspects, but it wasn't yet reliable for identifying a direct match. Nevertheless, despite being exposed to the elements for at least 90 days, Stephanie Nisnik informed authorities that the two hairs were microscopically consistent with the one from the necklace. Given that information, investigators sent out a full profile and sketch of the suspected killer, a white male between the ages of 19 and 26 that lives in Queensville and is poorly dressed. What the public didn't know at the time was that the police had already zeroed in their prime suspect, Guy Paul Morin. Then on April 22, 1985, the thriving musician was on his way to band practice when a police cruiser pulled him over. He assumed it was because he had failed to buckle up, but the officers promptly informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessup. The strand of hair gave the police enough probable cause to arrest him. Christine's mother was shocked by the news, telling the media of the Morins, "They were so good to us, that's why it's such a shock." But the prosecution would still have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Guy Paul was in fact the killer, and it wasn't going to be easy. The biggest issue they were facing was Guy Paul's alibi, as he couldn't have possibly made it back from work in time to abduct Christine. So detectives decided to speak with Janet again and see if perhaps she had misremembered the time frame. Janet initially insisted that she had not mistaken the time, but over several months, the police succeeded in making her question her memory of that day. Over time, people's memories get less and less reliable, and with the desire to find answers, it's easy to convince someone with leading questions that they may have misremembered. Eventually, Janet had succumbed to the idea that maybe she was off by 10 to 15 minutes, which would make it possible that Guy Paul had left work and immediately taken Christine from the corner store. So the trial began in January 1986, with various pieces of evidence misused to make Guy Paul out to be a psychopathic serial killer. One example was red fibers allegedly located on Christine's corpse and in Guy Paul's car. An anonymous source later claimed that the lab technician running the tests had been wearing a red sweater with no protective coat. Additionally, one of Guy Paul's cellmates had actually been an undercover officer, and he claimed that the defendant had said he would red rum the innocent, implying sinister attacks on children. Guy Paul argued that the informant had taken this comment wildly out of context. Regardless, Guy Paul was ultimately acquitted by the jury in front of a stunned courtroom, but his relief would be short-lived. The Crown quickly appealed the verdict based on errors and how the original judge explained the meaning of reasonable doubt to the jury. So in May 1990, Guy Paul went on trial a second time, and with very little incriminating evidence against him, it looked very much like the first. However, the prosecution changed their tactic by alleging that Guy Paul had seen Christine holding her recorder and decided to lure her into his car using his own woodwind instrument. Once again, Guy Paul took the stand to proclaim his innocence, but the jury returned with a unanimous guilty verdict this time. One juror later stated that she found Guy Paul guilty based on his lack of eye contact during the trial. He was sentenced to life in prison, and when asked by the judge if he had anything to say, Guy Paul remarked, "It's a travesty of justice what's happened today. I'm appealing." Now, this is where the story starts to get really crazy. Outside the prison walls, many people were starting to question Guy Paul's conviction and the legitimacy of the evidence against him. As a result, a new defense attorney was assigned to the case, and by 1995, they had scheduled an appeal. At this point, there had been significant improvements in DNA technology, so in preparation for the appeal, Guy Paul's team ordered new tests on the samples found at the crime scene. Then, just 4 days before the trial, the results came back, and they were enough to shock the entire nation. The semen found in Christine's underwear was not a match to Guy Paul, thus eliminating him as a suspect, with no other matches to the DNA at that time. Finally, all of the charges against him were dropped, and 3 days later, he was released from prison. In 1997, he was compensated with $1.25 million for the decade of his life lost. All right, let's jump ahead to October 2020. DNA and genealogy had come even further, so police submitted samples from Christine's clothing to the Texas laboratory Othram. The results offered 2 family trees, which investigators narrowed down based on people the Jessup family knew, leaving them with just one name, Calvin Hoover. Now, get ready for this. That name might sound familiar because Calvin was the husband of Janet Jessup's good friend, Heather Hoover, who police had interviewed shortly after Christine's disappearance. Calvin, however, had never been interviewed despite being on the list of close contacts Janet had given to the police in the early days of the investigation. Calvin had worked with Christine's father, and the 2 families were quite close. The devil in disguise had participated in the search efforts and even attended Christine's wake and funeral. Killers sometimes like to remain close to the case by helping with the search or even attending the funeral of their victim. They may gain inside information by staying close to the action. As well, the killer may get enjoyment out of the fact that no one but them knows the truth, and they are fooling everyone. At the time of the murder, Calvin was a 28-year-old tradesman with 4 children who often played with the Jessup's kids. In fact, 2 days before Christine disappeared, the Jessups went to visit the Hoovers at their home, as they so often did. During this final rendezvous, Janet offhandedly remarked that she would be taking her son to visit his father in jail, leaving Christine unattended for a short period. It's widely believed that this was when Calvin hatched his sinister plan. Attacking Christine may have been something that Calvin fantasized about, and he may have just been waiting for the right opportunity to attack her. Calvin submitted to his demons and took his own life through carbon monoxide poisoning back in 2015, but detectives were able to test the DNA sample saved from his autopsy. The results of that test offered a dramatic conclusion to a 36-year-old case. In the wake of this shocking and recent news, detectives are now examining other cold cases that Calvin may have perpetrated. They're also working to establish a timeline of his movements on the day of Christine's murder. As for Guy Paul, he's now happily married with children of his own and thriving as a piano tuner. Some red flags from this case. Sometimes killers are described as weird, but that of course doesn't mean that everyone who is weird is a killer. In contrast, a psychopath can blend into normal society quite well, and no one suspects them because they're charismatic and well-liked. This seems to be what happened in this case, as Calvin was never even interviewed by police. Well, there you have it. 2 devastating tragedies wrapped into one brutal murder case. I think we're all ready to move on to the last story, right? It was a premeditated and well-planned out crime that no one saw coming, especially the innocent victim, 35-year-old Kendra Hatcher. But even after justice for the atrocious crime had been served, people were left reeling over both the perpetrator's motive and their identity. Kendra Hatcher was a devout Christian from Illinois living in Dallas, Texas. Beyond teaching Bible study and doing mission work abroad, Kendra was also a beloved pediatric dentist, offering care to disadvantaged children. Then in 2015, she started dating Dr. Ricardo Ricky Paniagua, a dermatology resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. The pair hit it off right away, with Kendra even donning a sweatshirt that read, "I'm with Dreamy" on one of their first few dates. It seemed like a match made in heaven, but unbeknownst to anyone, hell was right around the corner. It was September 2nd, 2015, and Kendra had big plans to fly out to Cancun with Ricky the following day for a long weekend getaway. The couple had been talking seriously about getting married, so it seemed like the perfect time to escape their busy lives and focus on each other. That evening, Kendra left work and arrived back at the parking garage of her luxurious high-rise apartment building just before 8 p.m. However, as she exited her car, someone emerged from the back seat of a Jeep Grand Cherokee and approached the young dentist. Without warning, the unknown person pointed a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol at the back of Kendra's head and fired. The assailant then stole her purse and jumped back into the vehicle and sped out of the parking garage. Another resident of the complex, Hashim Saad, heard the commotion and called 911 immediately.
Hi, someone just got shot in the parking lot of the Gables Park 17. All I heard was screaming and then a loud pop, and then I saw her laying on the floor.
Paramedics rushed to the scene but found Kendra unresponsive, lying in a pool of blood. A handgun magazine and bullet fragments were located near her body, and while her purse was gone, the attacker left her cell phone behind. Authorities suspected that the crime had been a robbery gone wrong, but they would soon realize there was much more to the story than they could have ever imagined. During the autopsy, the medical examiner had concluded that Kendra's injury was consistent with an execution-style shooting. According to the official report, the bullet entered through the upper portion of her head and exited the chin. Furthermore, gunshot residue experts found evidence that Kendra's hands had been up and behind her head when she was shot. Kendra was adored by so many, and it was difficult to fathom that she had even been murdered, let alone executed. So, who was behind this horrific attack? Well, the very next day, police released video surveillance footage from the parking garage to the media, which showed grainy images of both the Jeep Grand Cherokee and its driver, who appeared to be a woman. In addition, another video showed a man leaving the Jeep, walking towards Kendra's car and then returning a short time later. 2 days after the appeal for help, a man named Jose Luis Ortiz contacted detectives and informed them that the Jeep seen on CCTV was his, but insisted that he had nothing to do with Kendra's murder. Instead, Jose told them that he'd loaned it to his friends, Brenda Delgado and Crystal Cortez. He claimed to have been eating dinner at a Chili's restaurant with Brenda when the killing took place. While he wasn't sure where Crystal or the Jeep was during that time, he explained to investigators that it had been returned to his home later that night. Jose also stated that he called Brenda after seeing his vehicle on the news, and she told him that Crystal might have been in the parking garage looking for drugs when something went very wrong. She suggested painting the Jeep a different color and even offered to pay for the expense. As a final word, she warned Jose not to speak with authorities as he could risk losing his U.S. citizenship. Investigators went to find Brenda and get her side of the story. When they got in touch with her, she was studying for the National Dental Hygiene Board exam at the library. When asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, she flaunted receipts from her time at Chili's with Jose and claimed to have never seen Kendra before in her life. After explaining that Crystal had been gone with the Jeep that entire day, police knew they needed to call her in for an interview as well. It didn't take long for the 23-year-old single mother to confess to being the driver seen on the surveillance footage. First, however, she alleged that she was simply looking for a parking spot. Then she made an unbelievable claim that left the detectives' jaws on the floor. She said an armed carjacker had entered the vehicle while she was driving with her young son. Finally, she said that the intruder had demanded she go to the parking garage, and that's when he fatally shot Kendra. But when investigators reviewed the CCTV footage, they found no evidence of a child being present in the car. When they confronted Crystal with this information, she changed her story again. Crystal implicated a man named Lamar as the killer, saying that she had no idea he intended to hurt anyone and just thought the plan was to rob someone. However, it was apparent to detectives that she was lying, and after more questioning, Crystal admitted to being involved in the murder plot. At last, when asked why she agreed to participate in the crime, she told them that none other than Brenda had offered her $500. Now, hold on to your hats, because this is about to get wild. You see, while all of these interviews were going on, investigators had already received a very unexpected tip from Ricky. He told them that he believed he knew exactly who was behind the wheel in the surveillance video: his ex-girlfriend, Brenda Delgado. So detectives asked Brenda about her relationship with Ricky, and she brushed it off, saying it hadn't been very serious and that she wasn't upset about their breakup. She also said that she didn't even know his new girlfriend's name, let alone what she looked like. Brenda and Ricky had dated sporadically from 2012 to 2015. They lived together for a short time and Brenda got pregnant with his baby. The two spoke about their options and reportedly decided together that it would be best if she got an abortion. Then when Ricky met Kendra, he sent Brenda a courtesy email letting her know that he had moved on for good. Brenda had responded kindly and merely asked if they could remain friends. Still, the detective sensed her deception and changed his tactic and began speaking calmly like a father figure in hopes of getting her to confess.
Right. I know exactly what this is about, and I understand what it's like to feel like maybe you're not good enough sometimes. I understand what it's like to want something that you can't have.
When that didn't work, the detective started to turn up the heat on Brenda.
What drives you? Sometimes it's hate. Sometimes it's love. Sometimes it's greed. In this situation, I don't think it was greed. I think it was hate. I think you hated the fact that you weren't good enough.
It appears that the detective is trying to get Brenda to express any kind of emotion in an attempt to get her to talk. First, he tries an appeal at her feelings for Ricky. That attempt fails, so he tries triggering an angry response instead by saying, maybe you just weren't good enough for him. If Brenda becomes emotional in any way, she may give the detective information about what happened. But Brenda continued to sit in silence and only spoke to deny any involvement. So after hours of interviews, she was briefly booked into jail for an unpaid traffic ticket, as that was all they could hold her on at the time. But unfortunately, she paid the fine and was released shortly after. Once out from police custody, Brenda contacted Ricky, lending her condolences and offering to deliver groceries to his home. While this could have been an altruistic move, it does seem somewhat surprising that she offered to deliver groceries when she had previously said her relationship with Ricky hadn't even been very serious. She may have been trying to reinsert herself into Ricky's life as a concerned friend now that Kendra was out of the picture, hoping they would eventually get back together. Meanwhile, given the evidence stacked against her, Crystal was arrested on capital murder charges. She maintained that the shooter's name was Lamar and that he drove a blue Chrysler Sebring. While the name turned out to be fake, detectives were able to track down a Dallas man with that exact car through cell phone records, and his name was Christopher Love. Authorities searched his car and found a gun hidden behind the glove compartment, which ballistic tests later revealed to be the murder weapon. The 31-year-old was subsequently arrested, and boy, did he have quite the story to tell. Christopher admitted to investigators that he agreed to murder Kendra because Brenda had promised to connect him with the Mexican drug cartel. She also swore to pay him in an abundance of money and drugs. So by this point, police felt they had enough evidence to arrest Brenda as the mastermind. While it turned out that she hadn't been driving the Jeep, she had clearly orchestrated the entire crime. In fact, Brenda had actually begun spiraling out of control right after the split from Ricky. She was suddenly showing up late to work, and her grades were slipping, all because of a growing obsession with Ricky. She even went so far as to hack into Ricky's email accounts, so she knew all about their planned trip to Cancun. Still, detectives were facing one big problem. Brenda had already hopped a bus to Mexico. As a result, she was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and the program advertised a $100,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. 6 months passed with Brenda hiding out in the town of Torreon before Mexican officials tracked her down. She surrendered without incident but could not be immediately deported. That's because she held citizenship in both the U.S. and Mexico, and Mexican law prohibits the extradition of individuals to countries seeking the death penalty for their crimes. However, Brenda was returned to face trial once the Dallas District Attorney's Office declared that they would not be seeking the death penalty. The lead prosecutor on the case offered Crystal a lesser sentence if she pleaded guilty to murder and testified against Brenda and Christopher in court. She accepted and was consequently handed a 35-year prison sentence, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. In October 2015, Christopher stood trial, and after a very short deliberation, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Then in June 2019, it was Brenda's turn to face the music. The entire time, Brenda kept her eyes down away from Kendra's family and the witnesses, but that all changed when Ricky took the stand. She stared at him the entire time, never moving, as he spoke about his adoration for Kendra and the plans they had made for a future together. Then it was time for Crystal to testify against her so-called friend.
She had created a fake profile under the name of Stefan, and she had Kendra's page under that and she was watching Kendra that way.
Crystal also stated that she and Brenda had only been friends for roughly 2 weeks before hatching a plan to kill Kendra. They first thought about injecting her with heroin, but ultimately decided that shooting her would be the quickest and easiest method. Next, they needed to find someone to fire the gun. That's when they encountered local drug dealer Christopher Love, and he agreed to pull the trigger. The jury deliberated for just over 20 minutes before returning with a verdict. Brenda Delgado was found guilty of capital murder and given an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for a final word on this tragic case, I think Kendra Hatcher's mother said it best.
You, Brenda Delgado, have earned your spot on this earth behind cold steel bars for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life.
Here are some final red flags to look for. Hacking into Ricky's email accounts is a red flag. Not only is this an invasion of privacy, but it's also a sign of an extremely unhealthy obsession. Creating a fake social media profile in order to spy on Kendra is another red flag. The more information Brenda learned about Kendra and Ricky's relationship, the more her fixation and jealousy likely grew. Signs an ex-partner may be dangerous, and how to stay safe. Many people may have some curiosity about an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend's new partner. However, sometimes that turns into an unhealthy obsession. Here are some signs that there may be cause for concern. If your ex-partner has any history of violence toward you or another person, they may be capable of violence toward you or your new partner, especially if the breakup was not amicable. If your ex is harassing you or your new partner by calling repeatedly, sending frequent unwanted text messages, or even stalking in person, make sure to document this and report it to police. Consider changing your passwords after a breakup, especially if you know or even suspect that